the DNC book series. So let's get this started. Really looking forward to this wonderful program. Um, Want to make sure everything's right. It's an honor and privilege to introduce Professor Suketu Mehta. He is the New York-based author of Maximum City, Bombay Lost and Found, which won the Kriyama Prize and the Hutch Crossword Award, and was a finalist for the 2005 Pulitzer Prize, the Literary Ulysses Prize, the BBC For Samuel Johnson Prize, and the Guardian First Book Award. He has won the Whiting Writers Award, the O. Henry Prize, and the New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship for his fiction. Mr. Mehta's work has been published in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, National Geographic, Granada Harper Magazine, Time, and Newsweek, and has been featured on NPR's Fresh Air and All Things Considered. Mr. Mehta is an associate professor of journalism at New York University. His book about global migration, This Land is Our Land, was published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux in June of 2019. He's also working on a nonfiction book about immigrants in contemporary New York, for which he was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship. Mr. Mehta has written original screenplays for films, including New York, I Love You. Mehta was born in Calcutta and was raised in Mumbai and in New York. He is a graduate of New York University and the Iowa Writers Workshop. And it's an honor and privilege to introduce Mr. Mehta. Good afternoon. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So I will go ahead and forward this to you. Mr. Mehta, go ahead and can start the program. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, so I wrote this book. It's a book about immigration. As Faisal mentioned, I was born in Calcutta, and I grew up in Bombay, and that's why I wrote my book about Bombay, Maximum City. And then in 1977, when I was 14 years old, I moved to Jackson Heights in New York, which is arguably the most diverse neighborhood in the country. And I moved not because I wanted to, but because my parents dragged me and my sisters here kicking and screaming. So it was 14, a really difficult age in which to move countries. I hadn't finished growing up in Bombay, and I was never quite well in my skin in the country that I had moved to. My parents put me in the nearest Catholic school. Now, in India, the better schools tend to be what we call the convent schools for the Catholic, usually Jesuit schools. Here, the school that I was thrust into in 1977 was an all-boys school, and I was the first minority in the school. This was not in Jackson Heights, but in a neighborhood in New York called East Elmhurst, which was a kind of white enclave. And Queens at the time, after the 1965 Immigration Act, was getting more and more immigrants. But the school that I had gone to was one of the last bastions of the older white elite. And it's no accident that the Trump family was living a few miles out from the school. And the school was filled with Irish kids and German kids and Polish kids, and these were the sort of white working class in Queens. And here I come in, fresh off the boat from Bombay. I was meat thrown to the lions. My second day in the school, this kid with red hair and freckles comes up to me at my lunch table and looks at me and says, "Lincoln should have never let him off the plantations." And I was like, but what's that got to do with me? So those 3 years in that school were extravagantly racist. I had to run home from school much of the time. The aggressions in my day weren't microaggressions, they were macroaggressions. Then I went to NYU, and I went to the Iowa Writers Workshop. I became a writer. But with each year after 1977, I felt my position in the country, in the United States, being um, uh, stronger. I would go to other countries. I lived in England, I lived in Brazil, I lived in France. And whenever my plane would come in into JFK and I'd see the Long Island shoreline outside the plane window, I'd feel this gladness. I felt that I was coming home. With each year, my position in the country became more and more secure, and I felt that I was leaving that racist Catholic school behind, that it was a thing of the past. We were all multicultural now. And then we elected a black president, and we had 8 years of this president. And he was half African, the son of an immigrant. Then came 2016, and my students at NYU were weeping in the streets of Manhattan. And I realized that another man from Queens was now the leader of the country, and everything I'd taken for granted got rolled back. And I started seeing this in the streets. I remember going to Hoboken in New Jersey, which had just elected a Sikh mayor, with my sister. And we were just going to get a drink by the river. And we were chased by this white guy who was screaming these racist epithets at us. And this was fitting with the Sikh mayor. We weren't safe there either. And I, came up against this question, which was increasingly being put, sometimes in person, sometimes on the online forums. Why are you here? Where are you from? And then it reminded me of a story my grandfather had once told me. So my grandfather was born in India, in rural Gujarat, when it was still a British colony. And he moved to Kenya when it was also a British colony, and worked all his life in colonial Kenya. And then he retired in London. So one day, he was sitting in a park in the north of London, minding his own business. And this elderly British gent comes up to my grandfather and wags a finger in his face and says, "Why are you here? Why don't you go back to your country?" My grandfather, who was a businessman, said, "Why am I here? Because we are the creditors. You came to my country. You took all my gold and diamonds. So we have come here to collect. We are here because you were there." And I thought this was a great answer for immigrants to the rich countries. Whenever we're asked, "Why are you here?" Well, we are here because you were there. So I started writing this book. I've been writing a book about New York for about a decade now, and I put aside the New York book after 2016 to write a book about immigration. To answer this question, why are you here? And it's not just in the US, it's all over Europe, in Japan, in the rich countries worldwide, where our position as immigrants is being called into question, our right to immigrate. And the debate about immigration is mostly from the perspective of the rich and of the developed countries. Should America let in immigrants? If so, how many? If so, should they be skilled or unskilled? What's in it for us? And I started asking, well, why do people move in the first place? What would make my grandfather give up everything he had known in rural Gujarat and move to a country he'd never been to in his teenage years and start from the bottom, sweeping the floors in an accounting office? What would make a Honduran mother take her child and endure an incredibly dangerous journey to go to El Norte and take this risk of being assaulted, raped, turned back at the border, losing her child? What is it that is driving people? So I started going around the world. I started meeting migrants firsthand at the US-Mexico border, uh, in, in the borders in Europe, at the Indian-Pakistani border. Um, and I started asking this question to migrants everywhere. Why are you here? What has made you give up your home and move? And so this book is the answer to this question. And I realized that there are 4 factors which are driving global migration. Today, there are more migrants than ever before. There's over 250 million people today, including myself, who are living in a country other than the one they were born in. They move for 4 factors: colonialism, and then what's replaced colonialism, which is corporate colonialism, war or conflict, and climate change. So let's take the first, which is colonialism, which is the proximate reason why my grandfather had to move. When the British got to India at the beginning of the 18th century, India's share of world GDP was around a quarter of the world's economic output. By the time the British left, some 200 years later, in 1947, India's share of world GDP was under 4%. The whole colonial enterprise had been run not for the benefit of the colonies, not so that we could get English or the railways, but so that England could get richer. So when I walk around London now and I see these beautiful palaces and museums, I feel I should have a room in one of them because it was built with my money. The French did it, the Portuguese did it, the Spanish did it. The Jason Hickel, who is an economist in Britain, has estimated that the amount of silver shipped between 1503 and the early 1800s would amount to a debt of $165 trillion that Europe owes Latin America today. And it's not just what they did, what the colonial powers did when they got there, it's how they left. 40% of all the colonial borders on the planet today, or all the national borders, were made by just 2 countries, England and France. When the British left India, they ruled with this policy of divide and rule, and they left 2 countries, which are now 3 countries, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And they made sure that they would leave ensuring conflict between the peoples that they had ruled. They had separate electorates while they ruled, separate electorates for Hindus and Muslims and Christians and lower caste Hindus. The French did the same thing in Africa. If you look at a map of Africa now, it abounds in straight lines. These borders were made by the colonial powers, and they cut through tribal homelands. So when we look at all these, small wars and tribal conflicts in Africa, and we wonder, why are all these people always fighting? Well, they're fighting because the conflicts are an attempt by tribal homelands, which have been nations for millennia, to regather themselves across colonial boundaries. The second biggest cause of migration is corporate colonialism. When the colonial powers left, they left behind their corporations. And these corporations are still in these countries, particularly in Africa and Latin America, taking what they want at will. And now people say about the United States, all this may be true for Europe, but the US was never really a colonial power unless you count the Philippines and maybe Puerto Rico. We were a colony ourselves. Well, we were certainly a colonial power if you expand the definition of colonialism as corporate colonialism. So in Guatemala, for example, just one American corporation, which is the United Fruit Company, owned 42% of all the land in Guatemala. Um, Between 1970 and 2010, Mexico lost $872 billion in what's called illegal financial outflows, almost all of it going from corporations doing business in the country to American banks. And during the same period, 16 million Mexicans moved to the United States. They weren't doing anything wrong. They were just following the money, their money. The biggest outflows from the developing world now go to tax havens. So 40% of the multinational profits in Africa are immediately moved to overseas tax havens. Developing countries lose 3 times as much to tax havens as all the foreign aid they receive. The third driver of migration is war, or little wars, big wars. We, the United States, invaded Iraq and launched an illegal and unnecessary conflict, and 1 million Iraqis lost their lives. I submit that 1 million Iraqis now should be allowed to move to the United States and get green cards. So a big theme of my book is immigration as reparations. And it's not just so the United States funded civil war in El Salvador cost another 75,000 lives. Small arms, the traffic in guns is another massive driver of migration. You know, there are all these gangs in Mexico and in Central America. Well, 3/4 of all the guns in Mexico and 98% of the guns in the Caribbean come from the United States. And anytime there's concerted action to stop this homicidal flow of small arms in, for example, the UN, the gun lobbies in the US put pressure on governments, on the administrations, both Democratic and Republican, to stop this, to stop the UN from taking any kind of concerted actions. During the Nicaraguan conflict, Americans sent 1.8 million guns into the region, and most of them are still there. And they're now in the hands of the gangs. The fourth and biggest driver of migration is climate change. The United Nations estimates that by the middle of the century, at least 1 billion people will have to flee their homes because of climate change. Now, who caused this climate change? We Americans are 4% of the world's population, but we put 1/3 of the excess carbon in the atmosphere. European countries, another 1/4. We're the world's biggest carbon polluters, but under President Trump, we were the only country to walk away from the Paris Accords. The Pentagon alone emits more greenhouse gases than 140 countries. The average American uses as much energy as 35 Indians or 185 Ethiopians. We're the world's leading emitter of historical greenhouse gases. But the effects of climate change are disproportionately being felt by developing countries. Parts of northern India and Pakistan will be literally uninhabitable by the middle of the century. The human body literally will not be able to go outside without roasting to death. So I've given you some of the numbers, and I think it's important to have the numbers, but you know, I'm a storyteller and my book abounds in these stories. So I'll give you some stories now which back up these these numbers. Um, I spent a lot of time in Tijuana, um, and I was at a shelter once, um, speaking to a young a Honduran woman from San Pedro Sula, and she had a little baby with her, an adorable 18-month-old baby. Um, and she told me she had to flee because her husband had witnessed a gang murder. So the gangs came to her and said, we either have your husband or we'll take your baby. So she took her baby and fled. And she was now in this shelter in Tijuana, and told me she was going to apply for asylum. And this was at the height of the family separation crisis, where we shamed ourselves as a nation by snatching babies from their parents' arms and putting them in jails thousands of miles away. And I warned her about this. I said, if you go, they might take your baby away from you. And she had tears in her eyes and she said, what a mother's love is. I would rather never see this baby again that I love with all my heart and know that he's safe somewhere, even if it's in a jail, than have to put him 6 feet below the ground where I come from. This was the choice that this mother was faced with. So the choice was made by us. We financed the civil war in her country. We put in the guns and we created the gangs that are now the scourge of the Northern Triangle. Um, these gangs were created in the prisons of California. And then we deported these young men and put them in countries where, most of them hadn't been in these countries since they were children. They had no idea how to earn a living. So they took these guns, which we supplied them, and homicide rates in the Northern Triangle are they're like a civil war. It's worse than Syria. So this mother was faced with this choice of running with her baby and staying home and losing her baby. The most affecting part of that reporting was a place called Friendship Park. Now, there is a fence between Tijuana and San Diego. And it's in a place called Friendship Park, which was established during the Nixon administration. It was a place where if you were on the American side of the border and you didn't have papers to cross over to Mexico, you could meet your family at this federal park, and you could sit down with them and have a picnic with them and give them a hug, and then they would go back to Mexico and you would go back to the US. The Border Patrol wouldn't ask for papers. So over successive administrations, since the Nixon administration, there were more and more rules imposed and more barriers, but it was still working. Under the Obama administration, the US government put up a fence. And under the Trump administration, there was this thick, ugly industrial mesh fence when I went there. And you could still meet your family, but only on weekends and only for 10 minutes at a time. So there were all these people who would come from all over the US because this was the only place on the entire southern border where they could greet their families face to face. And I spent 2 weeks there, just getting these stories firsthand of, and this was during a time where immigrants were, the president of the United States was calling them robbers and rapists. And the narrative spread about them was, they are here, particularly the undocumented and particularly Latinos, were in the United States to sell drugs, to rob, and to rape. They were being demonized, cast as, these people who were here as the greatest threat to your family, your job, your family. So I went first to meet these people first time. What are they like? And I met a Mexican man who had left Mexico 17 years ago because his mother was sick and she needed hospital care. And because of the state Mexico was in, he didn't have a hope in hell of working there. And he was from a rural area. Agriculture had been devastated. He couldn't work and provide his mother the hospital care she needed. So he went north and he worked here without papers in construction, worked brutally hard. And every week, whatever he saved, he sent back to his mother so that she could stay alive. Periodically, he would phone her when Skype came along, he would see her, but he really wanted to see his mother in person and his mother wanted to see him. So for now, after 17 years, he was going to meet her face to face. And he comes up to the fence and I see him going to the fence and I see his mom coming from the other side. And they both put up their faces to this thick iron fence. And he told me later, he could feel her breath on his face. And his mother said, "Son, I love you." And he said, "I miss you, Mom." And she says, "You're too thin. Doesn't look like you're eating enough. Why aren't you eating enough?" The question all moms ask their kids. Then he put up his hands to the fence. And he couldn't touch her. The authorities, the American authorities had decided that it would be too risky to allow these families to give each other a hug. They might pass contraband. God knows what they will do. But the holes in the fence were large enough to allow your pinky finger to go through. So he puts up his pinky finger, mom puts up her pinky finger, and they do this thing called a pinky kiss. And all along the fence, there are mothers and children, husbands and wives, brothers and sisters doing this thing. The slightest touch, the pinky kiss. It broke my heart. These people who are coming are emblematic of family values. If you ever had a break with someone in your family, go to this fence, go to this friendship park and see what happens when a state, when a bureaucracy, when lawyers tell you you can't see your family. This man, like most of the migrants that go from poor to rich countries, they go not because they hate their families or their languages or their food. They go because they have no choice. And once they're here, they work and send money back. Remittances last year, this is the money that people like this Mexican man send back in $50, $100 gyros. Remittances amounted to 4 times all the foreign aid in the world. It's much higher than all the debt relief offered by rich countries to poor countries. And remittances go not from government to government, where the governments in these countries siphon off most of the foreign aid and use it for themselves. It goes from the poor to their families. So it goes to a mother for her hospital treatment. It goes from a brother to his sister for her school fees. It goes to build houses. It's the single best way of helping the poor. And the way we can do this is, well, 2 things. One is reducing the fees on remittances that, for example, Western Union charges. And the other is to let people come here and work. During COVID, when governments around the world used the pandemic to impose new barriers on migration, remittances fell almost by a half. So this made people in poor countries suffer much more because they weren't getting the money that the relatives would be sending back. So I went around the world gathering these stories because stories are important, and then I put them in this book. And what I say is, the argument I make is migration is a good thing. It's good for people who are moving, and it's good for the countries that they are moving to. Because the rich countries aren't making enough babies. Birth rates in Europe and the US and in Asia are falling to levels where there are older people who are retiring earlier and living longer, and the old age pension system, Social Security, isn't able to keep up with the payments that Social Security needs to make out. So, I did a lot of research about this, and it's, the statistics are staggering. Half of all Americans are over the age of 40, and the US will become a nation of geezers as the baby boomers retire. Most immigrants don't come here with their parents. So the Social Security taxes go towards paying for other people's parents. From now to 2065, immigrants and our children will make up 88% of the country's population growth. In 1960, there were 5 American workers paying Social Security taxes for every retiree or disabled person. By 2013, there were fewer than 3 such workers. In 2018, the US fertility rate fell for the 4th straight year to 1.7 babies per woman. The replacement rate is 2.1 babies per woman. Starting next year, the Social Security Administration will spend more money than it collects. By 2035, its $3 trillion reserves will be completely gone. And if you retire then, Social Security will only have enough money coming in to pay you 80% of the benefits that you're entitled to. So the only thing that's going to save Social Security is immigration. Immigrants are 14% of the American population, but we started a quarter of all new businesses. And since 2000, we've earned over a third of all the American Nobel Prizes. Just one American university, MIT, the immigrants at MIT have earned more Nobel Prizes than all the Chinese Nobel Prizes combined. The statistics are, they just go on and on. 71% of Silicon Valley's tech workers are immigrants. The immigrant armada that is coming to our shores is actually a rescue fleet. So in my book, what I've tried to do is to combine the stories, the human stories, such as of this Mexican mother and her son, and economic statistics. And the argument I make is, when you let people move, everyone benefits. The migrants themselves, because it's a matter of life and death in many cases for them to move. The countries that they move from, because remittances are the best and most targeted way of helping the global poor, and the countries that they move to, because we can't survive without immigration. And it's a very personal story, because my family came here and our family benefited by it, and we made America a better place because of it. I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post saying, I'm an uppity immigrant. Don't expect me to be grateful. But you know what? I am, people have accused me of hating America. Ann Coulter went after me. I was on all these right-wing websites like We Dare saying, I hate America. I'm head over heels in love with America. And what I love is the American exceptionalism. That it's a country made up of all the other countries. I've lived in England, I never felt I could be English. I've lived in France, I've never felt I could be French. I've lived in Brazil, I certainly never felt I could be Brazilian, but a person can come in from the plane at JFK and feel American the moment they've stepped into Queens. I grew up in Jackson Heights, which is, I think, a model of the multicultural city. So the world is seeing a huge contest of storytelling. There are all these populists today. Putin in Russia, Orban in Hungary, Modi in India, used to be Trump in America, thank God he's gone, Bolsonaro in Brazil. What is a populist? A populist is a gifted storyteller, someone who can tell a false story well. And the only way he can be fought is by telling a true story better. This is why the populists hate people like me, writers, journalists. This is why writers and journalists are being jailed, killed, expelled, or taxes audited all over the world, because they know these populists fear us. They fear storytellers because they know that we can gather a story, we can back it up with facts. We fact check our stories, and we can tell a true story better. So this is why I wrote this book. I'm happy to take questions about immigration, about the process of writing it. I'll throw it open now.
Thank you, Dr. Mehta. Thank you so much for such a detailed summary of your work and your book. I think it's such an important subject that does not get enough attention in our country and beyond. We've been seeing some of these mass migrations from the southern borders. We're also seeing migrations across from Turkey into Europe, from displacement people from Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan. And obviously, we've seen a lot of mass migration from Rohingyas from the Burmese communities moving into Bangladesh. Excuse me. So I wanted to ask you a question, which I think you raised a very important point. I think that is really the heart that in the past, the French and the British had the colonialism, and then it transformed into corporate colonialism, which I would say, and I'd like you to shed some more light on this, is that now it has transformed into corporate colonialism, which is also a globalization of this world, which is exploiting the poor and the weak and the marginalized. And it's becoming, obviously, we can even see that in this country where low wages, people don't have access to decent health care, people can't even afford to rent an apartment now with the kind of wages they are making. And more people are not able to go to colleges. The cost is very high. So it's becoming a sort of a very global phenomena. What do you suggest now as an average constituent of voter in this country, or in Britain and in France? There seems to be a shift in public opinion where people have realized the damage they have done from the colonial past. And now with that, what you pointed out about the corporate colonialism or, the globalization, how can people, in terms from advocacy and activism and just an average person in the household looking and hearing this, and they have a question, what can I do? What do you suggest in terms from a universal message? Thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. We tend to think colonialism is, that was so 20th century. The British left India 70 years. So why do you keep whining about it? It's all over and done. No, it's not. History has consequences. And when the imperial powers left, they left behind the corporation. And I'll give you just one example. I was in Tangier in Morocco, and I met a young African family who, with their little baby child, it was newborn. I held a newborn in my arms. It was about a month old. They were going to cross the Mediterranean in basically a little lifeboat to get to Tarifa in Spain, and they were going to drug the baby to keep him quiet during the crossing. And I begged them not to because he was so little, he might die from the drug. And I, started asking them, like, they were from the country of Guinea, and they loved their baby as much as you or I would love our children. What is it that compelled them to leave and undertake such an incredibly dangerous journey? It wasn't, they weren't going to Europe for the bright lights of the Eiffel Tower. Uh, they had no choice in Guinea. They couldn't, uh, the baby might starve. The baby had no future. And then I started looking into the country of Guinea. It's not a poor country. That is, if you look at its resources, it's got up to half the world's bauxite. So bauxite is a mineral which is essential in all kinds of uses, but there is a giant hedge fund called the Oxziv Corporation. It's the world's the largest publicly traded hedge fund, which have bribed Guinean officials tens of millions of dollars and actually paid hundreds of millions of dollars in fines to the SEC and the Justice Department for corrupt practices in Africa. The head of the Oxziv Corporation is a man named Dan Ock, who bought an apartment at 220 Central Park South it's a building where the apartments go for $250 million. Another estate who was actually indicted, named Michael Cohen, bought a 900-acre English estate with this money. So in my book, I trace the money. That little African family is entitled to a room in Dan Ock's penthouse and a vacation in Michael Cohen's estate, because this is where their money is going to. I think it's really important. In Britain, for example, there's almost no mention of the colonial period in English history books. When the British think about the empire, it's TV series like The Jewel in the Crown or Passage to India. It's seen as, seen through this sort of sepia-tinged nostalgia. And there has to be this realization that the colonial powers enriched themselves and impoverished these countries, and they left behind, it's the borders that they left ensured permanent conflict between these countries. And so in my book, what I'm doing is I'm just connecting the dots. And one of the ways in which we can do this, we immigrants can speak to our neighbors and actually tell them, whether it's Americans or Europeans, about this colonial history, which most people have very little knowledge of because it's kind of kept out of the history books. This question my grandfather posed, it's a very simple response to a man who was asking him, what right do you have to be in England? We talk about illegal immigration, right? The answer that lots of Americans say, listen, I'm not against immigration, but you want to come here, you come here legally. Well, ask yourself this: did the West ever ask anyone's permission to go into these colonies legally? Did the British ask permission to go into the US legally? Or into India legally? Did the US ask permission to go into Latin America? When in nation after nation, whenever there was a democratic alternative to a military junta, it sent in the Marines to protect its corporations. Did the Americans ever ask permission? In the Dominican Republic, in Haiti, when they sent in their military? What I'm in my book, I'm asking for immigration as reparations, which brings me to Nadia's question, which is, how do you think immigration should be reparations for climate change? Last year, temperatures in northern India hit 123 degrees. Tens of thousands of people died. There was a study that came out of Stanford University that showed that since 1960, global warming has reduced the size of India's economy by 31%. But conversely, it's increased the GDP of coal countries like Norway and Sweden by 10%. So it makes agriculture impossible in countries like India or Honduras or Guatemala, where the devastation of the coffee crop is a prime driver in people moving. And as I said before, who's responsible for global warming? Well, we Americans, 4% of the world's population, have put in 1/3 of the gases causing climate change in the atmosphere. Europeans, another 1/4. But the effects are felt on the poor countries. Norway and Sweden, for them, as the Arctic melts, more and more areas of the Arctic are now accessible to them for agriculture and mining. So it's actually good for their economies in the short run, at least. According to an MIT study, temperatures might rise by 4.5%, 4.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. That means huge parts of northern India will be literally just unsurvivable. By 2050, land that is home to 650 million people will be underwater. And 1/3 of all of Earth, which is today home to 1.5 billion people, will be desert. And you're seeing this right now. You don't even have to go to India or Africa to see this. We're seeing this in our own country. We see this in New Orleans. We see this in the wildfires in California. You know, the chickens have come home to roost. There is climate migration taking place within the country. So in terms of global migration, you ain't seen nothing yet. And we need to come together as a planet to figure out how to deal with this coming climate migration, because nothing is going to keep these people out. I mean, soldiers shooting at them aren't going to keep these people out. They're desperate. And they're going to keep coming because they have no other choice. So in my book, I also, you know, and I want to make it clear, I'm not arguing for completely open borders right away. I'm calling for open hearts, not open borders. I think there are valid philosophical arguments to be made for open borders, but in practice, you know, I don't think we can just open up the borders and let people move. That will cause chaos. But there are intelligent ways of managing migration. So the US and Canada, for example, Canada wants to triple its immigration in the near future because it's a cold country, it needs warm bodies. Huge parts of the US are actually empty. The US is not full, it's a big empty country. And immigrants, you know, the US Conference of Mayors has proposed a system of heartland visas, which is you can come here and under the condition that you live for 5 years in inner city Detroit or Baltimore or rural Iowa or Maine. These are places which desperately need people. And you live there for 5 years and then you can live anywhere else. Canada already has a system of provincial visas where, you know, you live in Saskatchewan for a few years and you work and live and contribute to the economy, and then you can live anywhere else in the country. Something else that we can do is there are communities along the border, the southern border, for example, which bear the brunt of waves of migration, such as El Paso. Their schools and their hospitals need resources. American tech companies, American agricultural companies need immigrants. What if there was to be a fee or levy for every person that come in that work for these tech companies, and that fee was to be allocated to help communities that are adversely affected by migration, like El Paso or school districts in Long Island? There are intelligent ways of dealing with migration, of having both more immigrants and for, you know, the economic figures are indisputable. Immigration lifts all boats. But the immigration debate around, the debate around immigration in the US is, it's basically all heat and no light. It's the immigration bills aren't going anywhere in Congress. And because ultimately it's an emotional issue. You know, there's lots of numbers that we can throw at it, but ultimately it comes down to emotion and storytelling.
Okay. Interesting. I just want to remind the audience that if you have any questions, you can post it chat. as we're winding down to our program. So, Dr. Mehta, it's interesting, as you know, and probably the audience as well know, that there's been a rapid rise of xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and also anti-immigrant, sentiments across not only the United States, but we saw in Europe too, especially after Trump got elected. Somehow he had legitimized the hate and also kind of just lift the curtain to show that we may seem different from outside, but there's still a lot of work ahead of us to eradicate this unfortunately hateful ideology, which also really connects to your point you made that nobody has any idea about the colonial past because nobody has been able to read in the textbook or being educated about it, unfortunately. So now that we have encountered that, and we're still in the southern borders of the United States. We continue to see people being now told to stay on the other side of the border. As the Vice President Kamala Harris had a Freudian slip in Guatemala. She said, "Do not come," and she cannot say that, because there's international laws that if you're seeking asylum, political asylum, you are allowed to come in and file for asylum. Um, so now that we have, in terms of how can we change the narrative? How can we change? Obviously, we have to educate. As you said, it's really important to reach out to neighbors, and it's all about hearts and minds. In terms of the elected officials, how can we change the policy on that? And so it can really have, because we're seeing what has happened in Honduras and Nicaragua and Guatemala. Like you said, this one American corporation, I guess it holds like
United
40%.
Fruit, United Fruit, the original banana corporation,
United
owns
Foods. I mean,
42% of all the land in Guatemala.
100%. That's amazing. I mean, that's just phenomenal, and nobody even knows about that. So these are very important things. Do you think that? I mean, obviously the policy has to change in American foreign policy. It still doesn't seem to shift too much. We continue to go along with sound bites and political hashtags, but when it comes to a meaningful policy, nothing changes. So I'm trying to figure out, and I have a question. This is my question to you: is that how can we change that narrative? Is this the best way to just try to educate people, or I mean, there are a lot of groups and organizations, lawyers have spoken out. We continue to do so. There's obviously more mobilization now than it was before Trump. More and more groups have popped up. A lot of people are speaking out, but I feel that there's very little impact when it comes to really having a meaningful, paradigm shift. So I would ask you if you could illustrate, something. What can people do more, and how we can convince to change this and resist it. Because what I'm afraid of is that if this another situation like Trumpism and other arises, it's going to be much worse than what we have experienced. I hope not. I hope I'm wrong. But unless we don't really address these issues, we're bound to repeat it again. Thank you.
So I think the Democrats have to be much more radical about the need for immigration, have to point out to Americans that these people are coming here to America part, in large part, because what we have done to their nation. When Kamala Harris, goes to Latin America and says extremely rudely in their countries, "Do not come, do not come." Imagine if someone had said that to her parents, to her Indian mother and Jamaican father, "Do not come, do not come." Um, and I think, there's a section of so-called moderate Democrats which are pandering to what they imagine is these voters who won't have it any other way. But, these aren't people who are going to vote for them anyway. It is an outrage that the Democrats um, haven't pushed through an immigration bill. That first of all, they need to suspend the filibuster, and it's only Congress that can have any kind of movement on immigration. Just yesterday, a federal judge put the whole DACA program in danger, the Dreamers. And we now have the prospect that a million Americans who've grown up here, have known no other home, might be expelled. So you know, it might seem far-fetched that the Democrats would actually take any action on immigration, but if you had told me just last year that the whole notion of policing in America would change, that the whole notion of Black lives and justice for African Americans, their participation in every sector of the economy, that would change pretty much overnight. Who would have believed that? Justice comes dripping slow, but when it comes in a flood. And I'm convinced the same sort of thing can happen around the issue of immigration, as long as we're not apologetic about it. I feel that we're too we try to say, oh yes, but Americans, they have a right to have their values, and everyone should speak English, and we need to be apologetic about coming here, and and I say no. Um, we don't need to be apologetic about the factors that drove us here, which we need to claim our rights and need to say loudly, immigration is good for us, and it's even better for you, the country that we're moving to. The country would be over if it were not for immigrants. I mean, immigrants keep the country running, whether it's in the farms or the corporate offices. So it's the narrative and it's the attitude that we take. So in my book, I often feel that the debate around immigration is way too apologetic. And it's all about what's in it for the rich countries. And I'm just turning the tables. I feel we have to be much less apologetic about why we're here and the fact that we're going to stay.
Okay, great. Thank you. Again, the name of the book is This Land is Our Land, an Immigrant's Manifesto by Dr. Suketu Mehta from New York University. Dr. Mehta, it's been an honor and pleasure. Thank you so much for finding time to be on this program and its important discussions about colonialism, its past, and its impact all across the world, and the corporate colonialism. And I have to confess, I have not read your book. I have read parts of reviews, and I look forward to getting this book and making sure that I read this at my next trip to the beach before the summer is over. Thank you very much for being on this program, and I thank all the audience for sticking around with us and listening to such an important conversation. I urge that everybody please continue to have this dialogue and conversations with your neighbors, with your colleagues, with your friends on social media, and also with your incumbent elected officials or people that are holding the public office, even at the local level, because we are feeling the anti-immigrant sentiments and xenophobia even at local levels in small rural communities, in council seats, as there's a lot of debate going on the critical race theory, trying to deny what the past is holding. So Dr. Mehta, again, thank you very much. Again, the name of the book is This Land is Our Land, an Immigrant's Manifesto. I highly recommend everybody to get that book and share that with your friends and colleagues. Thank you very much, sir, and have a wonderful weekend to you and to all the rest of the audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.